Welcome to this Race to Resilience campaign launch event at the Climate Adaptation Summit. This is hosted by Gonzalo Munoz, my fellow climate champion from Chile, and by myself, the climate champion from the UK. For those who don't know, we are appointed by the UK and Chilean governments to fulfil the mandate which was created by the parties to the UNFCCC in Paris, which is to galvanise climate action by non-state actors, which in plain English means anyone who's not a government who's a signatory to the UNFCCC. So that means business, investors, cities and regions, civil society and academia. And that's why Gonzalo and I are so pleased today to say that the Race to Resilience has been launched, that the race is on. And it has one simple and crucial goal, which is to catalyse the actions of non-state actors to build the resilience of 4 billion people from vulnerable groups and communities all around the world by 2030, so that we arrive at a place where we're not just surviving climate shocks and stresses, but thriving in spite of them. This is a campaign for all countries, and it's a sibling to our Race to Zero campaign, which we launched last June. And both races are needed to succeed to deliver a 1.5 degree resilient world. And to be in the race, you have to be part of an initiative that is taking actions to build a resilient future. And we're now inviting such initiatives to express their interest to join, and we'll be hearing from some of these later in the event. So if you're interested in joining the team and joining the race, and if you're part of a national, regional or global network, details on how to do this will be shared afterwards. Over the last year, I've been on a deep journey where I've been reaching out and in dialogue with people all over the world who are working on resilience, and I've learned a lot. And one of the big lessons is that it has to put people and communities at its heart. So before we hear from Selwyn Hart, the UN Secretary General Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, I'm really pleased that we're going to be hearing in a moment from some people at the front line of climate change working on resilience. Before concluding, I'd like to offer some special thanks. Firstly, to the Government of Netherlands for hosting the Climate Adaptation Summit. And secondly, to the Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Centre at the Atlantic Council, and the Global Resilience Partnership and the Global Centre for Adaptation for organising and helping us put on this event. And particular thanks to Nidhi, Jorge, David and Anastasia. Thank you, and please join the race today.
The world is faced with many challenges, many uncertainties. Climate change, high levels of poverty, and now the COVID-19 pandemic, which has led people into further poverty.
Of late, we have seen frequent droughts, which are related mainly to issues of climate change. Like areas which used to receive adequate rainfall are no longer receiving the same. And that is all mainly in the rural/agricultural sector. Then the other side also is when we receive the rains, we have seen some settlements being flooded, and in some instances, sadly though, quite a number of settlements being affected, like the housing, the roads, the infrastructure getting destroyed because of too much rainfall in a short space of time.
Due to the effects of climate change, we have experienced a lot of challenges, which is on waste management and the flooding. And when it comes to the houses, most of the houses, they do collapse because of the areas are being flooded in our communities.
When we have a disaster in our country, like floods and this current COVID-19, I think resilience should come from the communities based on what the communities want and based on what the communities need.
I think maybe what is also important to appreciate is what is actually motivating this. That I think over the period, we've noted that our governments have become weaker in terms of their capacity to respond to these issues, be it financially, I think politically, the governance system are not in shape at the moment. So basically, there is no one listening to the communities, or rather responding swiftly to issues whenever they occur. So the only way for these communities to kind of continue to survive is for them to be in groups, that is to use their collective approach. So at community level, using the collective approach, that is what is currently being done to kind of engage and also craft locally based initiatives.
We have community-based enterprises, but it's at a small scale. And these are being trained how to manage the waste.
So in my view, I think the donor community, the government, and all the organizations that want to implement interventions into the community should first consult the communities on what they really want, and the support that they need to build their resilience, because sometimes the interventions from the donors or from the organizations might not be really what the communities want.
We need to be trusted. We need to be trusted and to be recognized as partners, not victims or beneficiaries only.
Social movements of the urban poor, SDI, of which I'm a part of, which operates in 33 countries and over 350 cities. We pledge our commitment, support, and total involvement in the race to resilience, and we will work side by side with our champions towards this.
Therefore, building resilience is a very important part of our work. Being able to bounce back from a difficult situation, that's what resilience is all about. And our work looks at building resilient communities.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, hello, my name is Selwyn Hart. I am the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Action and Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team. We've just seen how important building resilience to the impacts of climate change is for grassroots organizations and communities from developing countries. These were very powerful stories. As an islander and as someone from the Caribbean, I understand firsthand how climate impacts can devastate lives and livelihoods. A little over a week ago, UNEP launched its most recent adaptation gap report. It underlines the story that we've all heard before and reminds us that as temperatures rise and impacts intensify, nations, cities, businesses, and investors and other non-state actors must urgently step up action to adapt to the new climate reality we all face. This is why the Secretary General is calling for a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience this year. And he has placed 5 acts on the table. First, he's asked donors and MDBs to commit to direct at least 50% of their climate finance support towards adaptation and resilience. Secondly, he's asked to integrate climate risk into all policy making, investment decision making, and budgetary processes, and provide developing countries with the tools to do so. Third, he's asked for scaling up existing financial instruments, such as catastrophe-triggered instruments, and develop new ones that strengthen ex-ante resilience building. Fourth, he's asked for easing access to finance, especially for the most vulnerable, the SIDS and the least developed countries. And finally, he's asked for supporting the development and implementation of regional and local adaptation and resilience initiatives. Friends, I want to personally thank my very good friends Nigel and Gonzalo, our high-level champions, for launching this campaign. We welcome the Race to Resilience vision of placing people and nature at the center of the impressive target of catalyzing actors across the globe to build the resilience of 4 billion people from vulnerable groups and communities to climate risk. And before we hear from the 3 panels on the role of communities, nature, and businesses in building resilience, I want to conclude with a challenge. I invite all of you to join the race and to tell us, by COP26 in Glasgow, what you have already achieved in the coming 10 months. Not what you will achieve, but how you will double or triple efforts to deliver more. I thank you.
Hello, I'm Kathy Boffman-McLeod, Director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, or ERA, we are thrilled to support the Race to Resilience campaign. The ERA is a group of 30+ individuals, city leaders, companies, and more dedicated to addressing and reducing the risks and impacts of extreme heat to vulnerable people around the world. We're putting people and nature first at ERA, and we look forward to working with Race to Resilience to catalyze actors across the globe to build resilience of 4 billion people, from vulnerable groups and communities to climate risks. By 2050, we want to live in a world where all communities thrive in the face of multiple risks and uncertainty posed by climate change. Join us in the Race to Resilience. The ERA will bring educational resources, policy, risk and finance tools, and on-the-ground interventions to help reduce the risks, save lives, improve health, and protect people all around the world. Thank you.
My name is Salim Al-Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University Bangladesh in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where I'm speaking from. And my center also coordinates a network of universities in the least developed countries called the Least Developed Countries Universities Consortium on Climate Change, LUCCC, or LUC for short. And on behalf of both my center in Bangladesh and the Least Developed Country Universities Consortium, we are very pleased to be part of the Race to Resilience initiative. We work particularly with the vulnerable communities in each of our vulnerable countries, and what we are trying to do is to enhance the resilience of the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries. And we look forward to collaborating with others in the Race to Resilience.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel on Race to Resilience with Urban and Rural Communities. Today, we are here to discuss the actions behind climate resilience, the challenges that we face as a global community. And we have brought 3 esteemed panelists to join us today to talk about examples and actual case studies of the efforts that they have on the ground and how we can address some of the climate risks that are faced in both our urban and rural areas. Today, our esteemed speakers include Luis Betancourt, who is the director for the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation from the University of Chicago, David Del Ser, the principal consultant and director for Fin Salud Project for the BFA Global, and Ekosuehi Iyahin, who's the secretary general for the Insurance Development Forum. It's going to be a very interesting discussion, I am sure, and we're really looking forward to hearing from everyone. I'm Shannon McDaniel, the Director of Data Strategy for the Global Covenant of Mayors. And today I ask that each of the panelists begin by sharing a brief introduction to the work that they are doing, and then we will have a series of questions to elaborate and connect some of their efforts on the ground. So I will begin by asking Luis Betancourt to talk more about the work that he's doing with the participatory urban mapping and the Million Neighborhoods Map project. Luis?
Shannon, so it's a pleasure to be here with you. Our institute at the University of Chicago studies cities generally, and so our work is global. We work both in the United States and Chicago, as well as throughout the world. The work that brought us here really has to do with the fact that one of the big trends, one of the mega trends in the world is urbanization. And urbanization is proceeding particularly quickly in Asia and Africa, places that until recently were less urbanized. Of course, there's a different expression in different nations. But this gives us an opportunity to think about what urbanization may deliver in terms of challenges and opportunities, and specifically as we look ahead, how is it promoting human development in each one of these places, and of course globally by aggregation, but also what challenges creating, particularly to do with sustainability, carbon emissions, climate change, but also other issues, and resilience. To what extent are we creating societies that are healthy and across many respects, and in charge of their own destiny, so to speak. So a lot of our projects have to do with sort of this big framework, but in particular, we've been very interested in the development of many cities that is relatively informal, right? Where people come to the city, largely occupy land and start building. And most of the cities, particularly in Africa, are urbanizing very quickly to a large extent this way. But this is also true in India and other places in the world. So it's a major issue that is both creating cities quickly and organically in ways that are wonderful, but also creating a lot of challenges of poverty, lack of services, and instability. So what we do is to work with community organizations and large nonprofits that touch many places like Slum Dwellers International, but also with a lot of new data and opportunities to understand how data can be created by communities to advocate to their own priorities and issues and problems, and also data that's coming, for example, from satellite mapping and OpenStreetMaps, which is collaborative mapping online, for understanding what the built environment and the services and the settings of each neighborhood is. So the Million Neighborhoods Project essentially tries to collect data for every neighborhood on Earth, with an emphasis in these developing cities that comes from this data, and try to assess to what extent each neighborhood, which essentially, you can think of it sort of geographically as a city block, has services or not, how it may develop, and how to create models of urban planning that bring together local residents and governments with these new opportunities that bring in technology and data to accelerate the process, but also to reveal new pathways that will be context appropriate, but also address issues of resilience and sustainability.
Thank you, Luis. That's incredibly interesting. And I really have some great questions, I think, for you regarding that work on the ground and thinking about how that data can be leveraged. And one of the pieces that we know will need to be leveraged is some of the financial activities that can take place. So next we move to David Del Cer, who's speaking to us from BFA Global, to hear more about some of the efforts that you have underway with respect to financing as well.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and thanks everybody for joining the panel. Just a quick word on BFA Global, as the company I work with. We're an innovation company that is working to bring new solutions to all problems around economic development. Right? New solutions now being powered by new technologies. We have been collaborating with innovators and startups for over 5 years through our accelerator called Catalyse Fund. And the problem that we are sort of set up to tackle is the problem that's referred as the valley of death for innovation. Unfortunately, in emerging markets, there is very little, venture risk capital available for early stage companies. So that doesn't help create the number of companies that we need that would explore what is now possible, what value propositions are possible using modern technologies to create things that are more accessible, more affordable, more appropriate for low-income populations globally. As Luis was referring to before, in particular, farmers and fishers globally, but also in Africa, are being forced to change their behavior because of climate change, essentially. But sadly, they don't always have access to modern solutions that can help them make that transition. We feel that is a bit of an opportunity, big opportunity missed, because we could help them as they transition to a new way of working that is more productive and more resilient, and that increases their financial health. So the solution that we propose to this funding problem is a collaboration between impact investors, philanthropic donors, and venture builders that support these innovators in their earlier stages when they're the most vulnerable themselves. So what we do is we help them capitalize their companies so they can last, they have a longer runway, but we also crucially come in and help them develop their product, adapt it to their customers, and essentially throw expert skills at them to make them better companies. And we are pleased to report that the results of this approach have been quite positive. The companies we work with, which are now around 40, have raised, well, 90% of them are alive, which is pretty remarkable, and they've raised over $125 million, which is essentially 25 times more than we gave them. We feel that this approach that has been very focused on fintech can also extend to climate resilience, and what we are launching is a program to work with 20 to 30 startups focused on climate resilience in the next 3 years, leveraging our network of investors, researchers, and corporates in Africa. And of course, because this is a very early stage sector too, we will be sharing whatever we learn by working with these pioneers on the ground. So we look very much forward to updating our report on update in the next few months.
Sounds like there's quite a lot that you can share, and will be really interesting to circle back to you to hear more about some of the metrics of success that you've seen and thoughts on scaling. In the meantime, we turn now to Ekasuehi Yahin, and you will share with us some of the ideas around reducing the insurance gap, another piece that's incredibly important for financial success and for creating some new and innovative tools for these communities as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Shannon, and really to the other speakers who I think have touched on some really important points already. So the Insurance Development Forum, our purpose is really to extend and optimize the use of insurance and related risk management capacities to help build resilience and also support the provision of protection, particularly for low-income households who are exposed to the impacts of climate change, but also supporting the efforts with businesses, governments, etc. I think one of the key lessons we can all agree when we think about the impact of COVID and using it as an illustrative experience is that we need to become better risk managers. And the insurance industry can play an important role in terms of offering some of the kinds of solutions and tools that exist within the industry to support that agenda. And so for the IDF, this is a critical part of our mission, and a lot of our projects are centered on precisely that, which is how can we support, if it is households, governments, institutions, businesses, fundamentally, number one, in understanding what are the risks that we are dealing with. Because if we're talking about resilience, that has to be a central part of the conversation. What are the risks that we're dealing with? Is the information available in a way that is actually actionable and can inform decision-making as a starting point? And then secondly, another aspect of that is, can we create better tools, solutions for those communities that are particularly vulnerable? And we heard about the use of technology within that context. There's also a need for innovation. One of the things that I would say from an insurance industry perspective is that what we see across the globe is that when we talk about developing countries, significant rates of underinsurance. Most developing countries, the insurance penetration rate is about 3%. And so what does that mean? That means that when you do have catastrophic events, the burden of financing response falls on the state or it falls on individuals. And so the case that we are making is, can we leverage what we have learned through the industry to actually support better understanding of risk, but the provision of those solutions? But can we do that as a collaboration between both the public sector and the private sector? And again, referencing COVID and the industry in terms of the impact or the lessons we can learn when we think about climate change, is that we need to also be thinking proactively about bringing coalitions that can help us to address this. And so a lot of our projects are actually centered on bringing these partners together. In 2019, we launched a project jointly with the German government and the UNDP and the IDF insurance industry members to accelerate a technical assistance program with 20 countries by 2025, which is really focused on defining, again, accessible, affordable, meaningful risk financing solutions, but really going to the heart of the risk understanding agenda. And I can share a little bit more on some of the emerging projects, both in the rural but also urban settings, that could be quite instructive as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Ekeswe. I think there's definitely a strong interest in learning more about the projects and examples of successes or failures that you've had on the ground, and to hear more as well about your identification of, how the local governments and their understanding of risk, is it really up to snuff, and what do we need to do in order to improve that as well? But for now, I will circle back to Luis, and we will take on some of the questions that you flagged, or some of the ideas that you flagged around data connection. And one of the questions I wanted to pose to you was, the role of innovation in changing the conversation for informal communities in particular, in or near cities. Can you elaborate a bit on the resulting network of services that arise from needs within those communities? We will circle back to Luis. Unfortunately, I think he's had a connection issue. So David, I will move to you if that's okay. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about some of the strong success metrics that you've had with the acceleration model. And additionally, I wanted some thoughts from you on how finance can help to create and scale these solutions as well.
Well, thank you for that question, Shannon. What we're seeing is that the different startups all progress at different speeds, which is expected, but we're seeing some phenomenal progress. Some of our startups have already delivered services in 2 years to over 2 million people, for example. One of them is called Cheaper Cash. It's an African company connecting African consumers so they can exchange money across borders or within a country. And they've grown to past 3 million clients in 3 years. So some of them scale very rapidly because there is already a big market of smartphone-enabled consumers waiting for better products and services. So that's one example. Of course, for these companies to grow so quickly, they need themselves financial services, right? They're offering inclusive financial services to low-income populations, but they need funding themselves, typically from venture funders, venture capitalists. And we are seeing, and this is a great change, that 5 years ago, fintech startups in emerging markets were very exotic, and no one in richer markets would invest, say in Africa, for example. That has changed very much. And now we see increasing activity from Silicon Valley investors, for example, that are thinking of emerging markets as just yet another market, not something exotic and out of reach. So we are very excited about what these new amounts of funding can actually do to grow the industry.
That's really interesting. I think that there's a lot to be unpacked there, David. I wish we had more time. But in particular, drawing some of that interest from Silicon Valley also means an increase in the amount of data that's available for those communities, which can only be a huge benefit for them in particular.
I totally agree.
Thank you so much. We'll come back. But Luis, I think we have you again on the line. Hopefully your connection is okay. Were you able to catch my question just before you were dropped off? Great. Then please, you have the floor.
Sure. So I think that one mistake is to think that these communities are not trying to innovate all the time. So we deal particularly, as I mentioned, with almost the poorest communities that often are characterized as slums or neighborhood communities that are sort of developing in quite informal ways, sometimes quite far away from sort of government assistance and services. And so these communities are very entrepreneurial, but on a very, very micro scale, very small, small businesses, like the smallest you can possibly imagine. And they live in environments they're building themselves. And part of the issue is that they're exposed to enormous risk and a certain lack, indeed, of finance and other issues, but also supporting issues. So one of the issues is that public services is a universal challenge. And most of the neighborhoods that we deal with, we do a lot of surveys and collect data that's generated by the communities with their own interests to express what their challenges are. But one of the things that come up is that they're very exposed, for example, to flooding. So flooding and water management is one of the main issues that everyone complains about, because when people settle, you know, the land's not graded, there's no drainage, there's no sanitation typically. And so there are issues that are that basic that create a lot of instability. Another issue is fires. A lot of, you know, you have to imagine how people cook or how they heat. And so there are a lot of issues like this that create a lot of extra instability because of lack of public services. And so an issue of resilience is really how in these fast developing informal environments, we can create structures that deliver public services in potentially new ways using better technology or a more distributed system, but also how we finance them, how do we create services that are stable so that create a basis for people to be entrepreneurial or indeed to go on with their lives and be creative agents. So that gap is really massive. No one's really taking care of that gap. Institutions like the World Bank and other financial institutions essentially fund things typically at the national level. They don't touch places and people in these situations, or at least it's difficult for them to do that at scale in a person-centered way. And at the same time, that's a massive gap. And the other thing that you see is that a lot of the solutions are often there. People know how to manage money. They have savings groups. They have, you know, their own solutions for issues like this, of flooding and services. But they're very small, very improvised, and they need to be grown and developed such that those solutions can become solutions at a larger scale. And that kind of touching sort of that micro entrepreneurship with resources that reduce risk and indeed magnify the possibilities is missing very much. So
thank you, Luis.
Sort of informal mechanisms that I think industries are not following. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry if I interrupted you at the end. You froze on my screen. It's interesting that you bring up the topic of risk and how it's or experiences with hazards and how it's very obvious to those who are experiencing it. Ekoswehi, I have a question for you, and this is more related to the experience of local governments. So do local governments, from the perspective of the insurance industry, have an understanding of the risk that their city is facing and that vulnerable populations in particular are facing? And how can we make a more direct link for them on the financial impact that the city absorbs as a whole for these circumstances? And do you have any examples of this that you could provide?
Well, great question. And I think it's also related to some of the points Luis mentioned earlier. I think that government officials and many of the people that are at the front line of these issues understand the risks. The question is, you know, there's always scope for improving that understanding. There's always scope for better information. There is scope for making information, as I mentioned earlier, available in a way that is meaningful for these communities. And especially when we talk about risk information. And so I do think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done around that, but we are seeing some innovations in that context. One of the things that I can point out, for example, is an initiative that I was personally involved in, which was called the African Risk Capacity, where, yes, it was at a sovereign level, but it was an initiative led by the African Union and the World Food Program, which is a UN humanitarian institution. But it was a recognition that we needed to find some kind of financing solution that could get response to vulnerable communities very quickly after a drought event had occurred. And so there was a proactive measure to actually link the provision of the insurance instrument with the contingency plans and the humanitarian activities that were actually within that country. But importantly, as part of that process, there was also a heavy engagement with the government to try to distill what does drought risk mean for you, not only in terms of the budgetary implications, but also the impact in terms of livelihoods and lost development. And this information was actually quite critical for the officials to begin to think quite carefully about how they then shape the budget to actually respond to the needs of the communities, but also in the interest of their long-term development agenda. And so I think that these kinds of solutions where there is a coupling between or a recognition of the needs for the particularly vulnerable countries and steering national governments towards prioritizing even to an even greater extent how we address those needs are quite important. Within the IDF, and I will touch on another example that we have, where it is a collaboration between the IDF as well as the government of Peru, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Finance, and the Domestic Insurance Association of Peru to undertake a project where the government was concerned after the El Nino floods of providing some kind of insurance coverage for public schools, 50,000 public schools. When you have a flood event and these schools are destroyed, the infrastructure is destroyed, children are out of school for a while, there's an impact on families, there's also an impact on the government as a result of this. And so their thinking was, can they work with the insurance industry to help them first and foremost to build a database, a stock of public infrastructure, public schools, which they can use to inform broader risk management practices, but also the structuring of insurance. But critical to them was also getting the domestic industry involved within this process and also leveraging technology. So having pictures of the buildings, taking a stock of where they are, thinking proactively about procurement processes so that they can reconstruct better after and faster after the event, were all part of the spectrum of kind of, I would say, risk management activities that we are heavily invested in engaging with the governments around, because we see this as really critical when we talk about resilience, is supporting governments in developing their own risk management capacity. So those are the kinds of projects that the IDF is really focused on scaling up and accelerating in terms of addressing the impacts of climate change, particularly on vulnerable countries and communities.
Thank you so much, Ekoswehi, and really important to continue the collaboration where you're increasing not only the amount of knowledge for the insurance industry, but for the communities themselves as well. It's a record of where we are at and how the communities are growing. It seems we have sped through our time a little too quickly, so we're just down to the last few minutes. I wanted to give everyone 30 more seconds and to quickly answer a quick question. So for David, I was wondering if you could provide very quickly an example of startups that are bringing insurance products to the underserved, or any that are connecting rural and urban settings.
Yeah, we did not expect, but we ended up having 5 to 6 insurtech companies within our portfolio. I'll give you one example of a company in South Africa called Mobilife. They offer life insurance products and funeral insurance products using technology to distribute them. And they're pursuing a very innovative partnership with a company that has a network of 200,000 shops in all over South Africa that can do the retailing of the insurance product. So they connect with each other via APIs, essentially over the internet, and can, with this collaboration, can reach massive numbers very quickly. So that would be my example for the 30 seconds.
Thank you, that's great. For Luis, can you elaborate a bit on the broad range of data that's available from different cities, and how in areas where maybe they're data poor, though some of those experiences can be brought in from places where it's data rich, and you can share broadly across the urban and rural spectrum as well, where some things might still be informative, and even though the setting is quite different?
Yes, there are several sort of layers of this. So on the one hand, what's happening is that a lot of communities are mapping themselves, sometimes for the first time, again, because they're informal and their built environment is changing a lot. So they're doing that using cell phones and GIS-enabled devices, and then devices online like OpenStreetMaps, which is collaborative, allows them, but also other services that are coming up to allow them to do this, to make sense of their situation in place. And essentially creating maps, but then also plans as changed maps. They're essentially, from the technical point of view, probably better than what a planner could be able to do, because there is not local knowledge embedded. But all this infrastructure of community having access to technologies and using them in their own sort of interest and in their own context, collaborative mapping and other online sort of volunteer efforts, and then of course the technology that's coming from satellite companies and machine learning that's creating more quickly sort of a map of the built environment. This is all connecting. And so we see our role as inverting the usual process of large companies and large international organizations coming in and telling people what to do, but rather to do sort of solve the paradigm of urban planning, right? Which is that we should be doing people-centric development where the knowledge and needs of people somehow drive the process. So this is all being made possible because of technology and because of greater awareness of the problem, but it still needs to come to scale.
And hopefully changing the story so you're empowering those that are living in these communities rather than having them someone else come in and tell them how to behave. This is not a 30-second question, but I'll ask it anyway. What do you think is the role of regulatory approval with new technology? And how do you see that this already does or potentially will affect risk with financial instruments?
Yes, 30 seconds is not enough, but I will attempt. Regulation is extremely important. Insurance is a regulated industry after all. And I think that one of the things that we are seeing is that we're hearing a lot about technology and how technology can help in terms of supporting financial inclusion. We could put it in that broad term. But the regulators in many of these countries are not necessarily up to speed with the kind of pace of technological innovation that we are seeing being introduced to these markets. And so there is a need to also focus importantly on that, because that's about protecting the consumer, protecting these same communities that are vulnerable, and look to the governments to actually protect their interests. And so I think that this is actually a critical piece when we talk about the role of technology in supporting resilience. And within the IDF, we actually launched a report recently that was focused on this nexus between the protection gap, the role of insurance, and also regulatory issues that we need to be thinking about, regulatory from data protection all the way through to the development of these products. It's an emerging one, and I think really needs to come more into focus in the broader conversation around insurance, climate change, and also resilience and protecting livelihoods.
Thank you so much to all of you. This was a fantastic, very brief conversation, one that I hope that can be elaborated. But from touching on the parts of data and gathering on the ground to building out financial inclusion for communities and looking at how insurance can help mitigate risk in the future, I think we've covered a very broad spectrum that's very important to be inclusive with these vulnerable communities and to think about how cities can take action and make plans to build more resilient, secure, and sustainable cities in the future. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Shannon.
you.
I'm Karen Sack, CEO of Ocean Unite. On behalf of the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, or AURA, I'm delighted to support the Race to Resilience campaign. AURA is a multi-sector collaboration working to build resilience in the regions and communities most vulnerable to ocean risk by driving $500 million of investment into coastal, nature-based solutions by 2030. We are working with partners around the world to develop insurance and finance products for coral reefs, mangroves, and other coastal habitats, as well as the people whose lives and livelihoods depend on them. We're putting people and nature first, and we look forward to working with Race to Resilience to catalyse actors across the globe to build the resilience of 4 billion people from vulnerable groups and communities to climate risks. By 2050, we want to live in a world where all communities thrive in the face of the multiple risks and uncertainty posed by a changing climate. Join us in the race to resilience.
Welcome all to the Climate Adaptation Summit. We in the High Level Climate Champions team are very excited to host this panel on nature's place in the race to resilience. Nature is not only the very foundation of life. Nature and the ecosystem services it provides are an essential component of the overall global effort to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Considering this and the urgency of tipping points of planetary boundaries, we must succeed globally in becoming nature positive by 2030 and achieving scientific goals for both biodiversity and climate change in this decisive decade. This includes having regenerative production systems, particularly regenerative food systems, restoring over 350 million hectares of degraded land, and protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030. I want to stress that we must do this and more because nature provides enormous opportunities for livelihoods, for regeneration, for job creation, and it is the foundation for climate resilient societies. My name is Irene Suarez, and I am the lead of nature-based solutions for the High Level Climate Champions. Martin Berg and Kathy Bauman, Walter Vergara are the panelists of this panel on Race to Resilience. And I will have the honor of moderating this panel. It is a pleasure to be here with you three, and you can see their bios in your screen right now. The purpose of this 25-minute panel is to discuss, from a non-state actor perspective, opportunities to unlock the role of nature to enhance resilience. The Race to Resilience, launched by the high-level champions Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz in the Climate Adaptation Summit, will provide other opportunities to hold dialogues such as this one. In this opportunity, this panel has a particular focus on the opportunities of financial aspects. So let us begin our panel with you, Kathy. You for many years have led on both innovation and resilience. After many years of scientific research, community outreach, policy strategies, and multiple stakeholder efforts, you have set out mechanisms to support resilience. How are innovative financial mechanisms supporting communities and ecosystems' role to protect the most vulnerable?
Irene, I think the best example I can give is the recent success of an insurance policy on a stretch of the Mesoamerican reef in Quintana Roo, Mexico. And for many years, when I was at the Nature Conservancy, my colleagues and I, with the community and the state of Quintana Roo and so many others, the Hotel Association of Quintana Roo and of the tourism area there, of Puerto Morelos, we work together to think about how, if we know that the reef is acting as a natural seawall and the reef is under threat from climate risks, climate impacts, particularly storms that were breaking off those protective top corals, how could we use the risk industry? How could we use insurance to bring private capital to help repair and sustain the reef's ability to protect the coastal economy, which is $10 billion every year in Quintana Roo for beachgoers and all the folks that come. And during COVID, just this last year, during a pandemic, 1 million people still visited. And so just to give you a sense, and so the community works in the hotels and there are tour operators. And so we worked with Swiss Re to figure out how can we create an insurance policy that pays to the reef. And so we were successful in doing that. And there are all sorts of resources to share more about that, which is a short panel today. But in essence, the reef protects the shore, and the shore is the economy, and it's the jobs of the local community. And so this approach is being replicated now in the Great Barrier Reef and in Indonesia and Florida and Hawaii, Guatemala, Belize. And so it's not just reefs, but other natural resources can be insured, urban forests, et cetera. And, you know, we have a saying, nature reduces risk. It's really simple and really true. It can be quantified and it can be monetized. And that is part of the innovation. One thing to mention is that to keep it going and to upscale it and to support communities making decisions about resilience and reducing the risks of climate, we are developing now at the Rock Center a tool that decision makers use that incorporates the costs and, it's an economic cost benefit tool based on a tool called the Climate Adaptation, the economics of climate adaptation. But in essence, it takes into account biodiversity for the first time in a cost benefit analysis, along with gender and social vulnerability. And so we'll be bringing that tool into the race for resilience as well for communities to help support those decisions. And so innovation around nature is everywhere. And I'm so excited to see that approach in Quintana Roo replicated around the world.
Innovation is certainly being appreciated through this experience. Thank you so much for sharing this, Kathy. This is truly inspiring. And as you just pointed out on the monitoring point and the evaluation, we all know how important it is to monitor, report, and evaluate, including to enhance replicability. And this is a key issue for climate change. And obviously what we cannot measure, we cannot improve. So based on your experience, how is the quantification, how is the monitoring advancing, and one specific point of monitoring, how, based on this, how many people have you seen benefit already? It's soon, but it's already being replicated in other regions, and that's wonderful. So can we get a sense of that angle?
You bet. So, there's direct and indirect and lots of layers to look at. Part of the approach, it's not just insurance, it's also about how the community has been trained to repair, respond to it. They're first responders. And so they are called out immediately to repair and clean the reef. And so you have job creation. When folks can't work because of a storm, they are able to work and be paid through the mechanism of this insurance policy, but also a trust fund that's developed to help do more than just move money from an insurance policy and payout. So our estimation is 400,000 people benefit from this approach. And you have people that are frontline in the hotels, people in the community working in the hotels, people coming to partake of the services and the tour operations. Then you have the job, the training, and then the brigadores, who are the people who respond to the reef. And then you have the tax revenue that comes to Quintana Roo writ large. And so our estimation, which I could unpack more fully later, is 400,000 people made more resilient by this approach.
That is truly impressive. Thank you so much, Kathy. And clearly this is a case for further inspiration in other regions. That's great. And clearly this is a case where appreciating nature as a capital asset is coming to life. And so let's expand further on this point from an investment perspective with the experience of Martin Berg. As we know, we must mobilize both public and private financial flows to build nature positive economies. And Martin, you have had experience on both. And so based on the fact that you currently are actively involved in how HSBC has partnered with Pollination to create further funds, what are the early experiences or opportunities that you have found so far in financing nature-based solutions that specifically enhance?
No, thank you very much, Irene, and I'm really delighted to join you on the panel. But maybe let's start a little bit. I think you gave a really nice introduction. I think what we see now is really like we like to say nature is capital. I think and we really have to recognize this. And what we see at the moment is really that the whole question of nature, biodiversity loss is really becoming much higher on the agenda, also for financial firms. And it's not only the fact that we already lost nearly 1/8 of our biodiversity, but it's also, I think, the COVID crisis has really highlighted there's actually a real impact now that nature has, and financial and other corporates really ask themselves, okay, how do we actually have to look after nature, and how we have to factor in nature into our supply chains, into our portfolios. And I think this is really driven a real change in thinking about nature, in particular in the finance sector. You see this and a lot of new business groups. There's the Finance for Nature Pledge. HSBC is part of that. I believe there are now 37 organizations that are really looking into this. And they're all looking a little bit more from the risk side at the moment. Another initiative that is now upcoming is the informal working group that wants to establish a task force on nature-related disclosure. So you see there's a lot of attention on the risk side. And what we from Pollination, where eventually started, and HSC really looked at it saying, well, if you have so much intention, you also have to actually turn it around, and you have to also allow for investments in nature, because only if we really attract the investment into nature, we can actually change things. We can change existing investment practices, and thereby actually then also enhance ecosystems, and of course also achieve a higher resilience. And so what Pollination and HSBC have done is to form a joint venture to build out an asset management company that is exclusively focused on natural capital. So the idea is really to have a financial firm that is only focusing on bringing out financial products for institutional and other investors. And the logic behind this is really that one of the thesis behind this is really that we're needing much more scale in order to really move the financial sector into this space. So what we've seen in the past is there have been a lot of interesting ideas, but very often they're a little bit smaller, and that really hinders a lot of the large-scale investors to enter. So the logic behind the joint venture between Pollination and HSBC is really to bring a return-focused investment strategy, combine that with impact, and then really bring to the scale to the market.
This is truly encouraging and a great opportunity for small businesses. And Martin, building off of that, how do you believe we can get more capital investors and companies interested in enhancing resilience through nature and benefit the most vulnerable populations? How do you think we can get more companies and investors?
Yeah, what we really need to do is we need to move from the risk focus to focusing on the opportunities that nature also entail, for not only for investors, but also for companies. And we need to recognize that actually a lot of the solutions that nature can provide are often as good, in some instances even better, than some of the built environment or the built infrastructure that we're using. And I think that's not that easy. That communication is really not that easy, because when you look, for example, at investors, obviously they would like to understand, if I invest money into something, I need to understand what are actually my revenue streams and how do I get my money back and how to also can achieve a return. And that is not always as obvious with nature. And I think what we need to do is we need to be very clear and communicate what can be done and for what investors can be, what strategies can be offered for what investors. So for example, what we are trying now to do, we just joined the Natural Capital Investment Coalition that His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales just announced at the One Planet Summit. And the goal really there is really to build out an alliance between aligned asset managers and other investors to really communicate much better what are the opportunities of investing in nature, what type of revenue streams can we having. And the way we see it is really what we need to communicate is that there are investment opportunities where we can actually use the impact in not only to do the right thing on the ground, not only to do good, but actually to do well. In that sense, for example, you mentioned regenerative agriculture practices. What we see is, where we have concrete examples, is by investing by imposing changes in the project, going more regenerative, we can actually achieve over a longer time horizon not only higher impact on the ground, but also a higher financial return. So this is really a nice example where we're having an opportunity to combine both to attract long-term private sector investment with on the other hand also really an impact focus, and they were also obviously focusing on resilience, because what we see on many of those projects is the reason why they're producing more impact is because they're more resilient. So we have a lot of examples where agriculture practices were changed, where from a sudden different crops could be planted, and where a parcel of land becomes much more resistant also to floods and to droughts. That obviously increases resilience, that increases soil and the CO2 absorption of the soil, but also over time it actually creates a higher yield for the investors. So those are the type of situations that we would like to finance, and also those are the type of investment situations that we really would like to communicate to the market as part of the alliance.
Amazing, and congratulations for that, Martin. And really like that point of the importance of shifting the mindset, the communications from risk to opportunities. Really encouraged by your work, by that you mentioned of Terra Carta and the work of so many others, Business for Nature, Nature for Climate, and the WBCSD, the WEF, who just launched last year this Nature and Economy report, touching upon those opportunities of long-term positive impacts, not only for business, for subnational authorities and for countries and regions. So thank you so much for that. Completely agree on the importance of shifting to opportunities. So many thanks, Martin. And let's move on to more of a systemic perspective as well, which both Kathy and Martin, you've touched upon some of those key points. And Walter Vergara, you've been leading and managing the 20 by 20 initiative, which has required precisely systemic approaches. And you've worked with national authorities, with subnational authorities, local communities, businesses, and just as Martin, you have also worked with capital investors in delivering the goals of restoring degraded lands in Latin America that will also enhance resilience in a complex and interdependent system. So Walter, please, can you share with us your findings on how to best enhance resilience? What have you seen can help enhance resilience? Over to you, Walter.
Thank you, Irene. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel and in the Race for Resilience. Initiative 20 by 20 was launched in 2014. It's a regional initiative led by 18 governments with the objective of changing the dynamics of land degradation in Latin America. This is a very important issue that touches on many topics related to sustainable development. The initiative has had a short-term goal of reaching 20 million hectares under intervention by the end of 20 by 20. This goal was surpassed. Today, we have 195 private projects in 25 million hectares. The initiative has, as you said, a systemic approach based on 3 pillars. One is a policy dialogue, which is carried with the principals in the countries. Principals means the ministers of environment and agriculture, but it also has an analytical pillar that is required to support those policy decisions by filling in information gaps or answering and addressing some of the barriers that are identified in the path to land restoration. But finally, one of the most important pillars is an investment pillar. And we recognize that in order to be sustainable in the long term, this investment has to be driven by private sector. The initiative has an alliance with 85 technical partners, 18 governments, as I said, but also with 22 impact investors. These investors are the ones that are behind the 195 projects on 25 million hectares. And the investments have been done on 5 windows: reforestation, avoided deforestation, landscape management, which means agroforestry and silvopastures and other techniques, grassland restoration, and low carbon agriculture. And these 22 impact funds working on those 5 windows have different business models. But what we have seen is that there is a momentum, that there is opportunity, and there is capital to invest. In fact, we believe that capital is not, as Martin said, the availability of capital is not really an obstacle. What we need is the identification of a robust portfolio of opportunities with clear business cases that could be used to advance these goals. but much more needs to be done. And this was outlined at COP25 by the Ministers of Environment, who issued the Madrid Declaration, asking 20 by 20 to go to 50 million hectares under restoration by 2050, and include 30 million and promote the inclusion of 30 million hectares of land restoration in the NDC goals by 2030.
That is amazing, Walter. Thank you. And so given that you do have the private sector already investing, from a systemic perspective, again, what do you believe is required to upscale the unlocking of nature to enhance resilience?
That's a very good question, and one that we have been since the Madrid Declaration. So we have developed a scale-up strategy, and this scale-up strategy has a number of elements. But basically, it resides on the fact that while there is capital available, the goals to go to 50 million hectares by 2030, and I forgot to mention 250 million hectares by mid-century, will require substantial amount of capital well beyond the resources that are available through impact investors. So we need to attract other sources of capital, as Martin mentioned. But in order to get to that scale up besides capital, we need to accelerate the dialogue with communities to address issues of legality and other legal barriers that are associated to land use in our countries. And that means making sure that land titling is correct, that the ownership is clear, so that more land can be aggregated with smallholder plots to add to a very large interventions. We also need to accelerate the issue of identifying and clearly structuring the big baselines on which new products can build up. And these baselines have to do with the protocols for carbon, biodiversity, community welfare monitoring that are required and are part of the mandate of impact investors. In addition to working with communities, with baselines, with new sources of capital, we need also to work with the structuring of corporate structures at the rural spaces. So that doesn't mean that they need corporations, but there is a structure that is able to capture capital, to capture the inflows of information and other inputs that will facilitate scale up in the process. So all those four activities are part of this scale up effort. I'm happy to say that we already have a number of projects that will go from 10,000 hectares to 500,000 hectares that are being designed at the moment. But that's the key. We need to scale up, as you well said, Irene.
Very good. Thank you so much, Walter, for pointing to those structural issues that are so important for this upscaling. So it is clear that nature's role to face climate change is already being delivered. It is visible, and we are measuring its impact. You've laid that out wonderfully, and I want to thank you. I want to thank the three of you for having accepted to be our panelists. And also I want to thank you for your incredible, impressive work and for sharing your valuable insights and inspiration. So to close and summarize, I'd just like to say that we have heard in this panel that nature's role to enhance resilience can be exponentially scaled up. We need for that to shift communications, mindsets from risk to opportunity. We need to have robust portfolios of opportunities, as Walter pointed out. The land titling and baselines are essential components to the scaling up, valuing nature fully. And I'd stress the radical collaboration. I think all of your cases are examples of collaboration to make this happen. So with enabling conditions of our government decision makers, and obviously that requires for all of us to engage actively with government officials and support them in achieving these opportunities. So Action is needed now to ensure that we unlock the full potential of nature to enhance resilience. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here, all the participants. And I'd like to ask to please contribute to supporting nature's role in the race to resilience and thrive. We all play a part of this success story. Lastly, and very importantly, we invite you all to join the race to resilience. Many thanks.
I, Jay Coe, Chair of the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group, GARI. On behalf of GARI, I'm delighted to support the Race to Resilience campaign. GARI is a U.S. nonprofit organization that brings together global private investors, investment advisors, governments, companies, entrepreneurs, and climate experts to discuss how investments will be affected by physical climate risk and what opportunity there is to invest in climate resilience. GARI is an official partner of the UN Secretary General's A2R Climate Resilience Initiative and is sponsored by the Lightsmith Group, Kresge Foundation, and State Street Global Advisors. The race to resilience is the race to a resilient world, where we don't just survive climate shocks and stresses, but thrive in spite of them. For this, we need private investments into resilience for businesses and communities to prosper. By 2050, we want to live in a world where all communities thrive in the face of the multiple risks and uncertainty posed by climate change. Join us in the race to resilience, where increasing investment into resilience is an absolute essential. As a partner of the Race to Resilience, GARI will bring its members together to increase their ambition to support safeguarding individuals, society, and the economy against the physical risk and impact of climate change through increased investment, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Climate risk is today risk. It's humanitarian risk, economic risk, and financial risk. But climate resilience is also today opportunity and investment opportunity as well. Join us in the race to resilience. Hi, my name is Jay Coe. I'm the chair of the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group, and welcome to our panel discussing the race to resilience and its opportunities for investment and businesses. We have a fantastic group of experts here today that represent investors, strategic companies, and new technology entrepreneurs to talk to us about how the race to resilience creates opportunities for investment and increased ambition. So we'll just get started by jumping in with Marion. Marion, you work with a leading UK pension fund and are also heavily involved with the Institutional Investors Group on climate change. And would love to hear how you see awareness of the risk of climate change among investors, and if you can give some examples of that.
Yeah, well, I think investors are increasingly aware of climate risk. I think their knowledge of physical climate risk is poor. It's really poor. I mean, well, that's a problem across society. You know, the science is strong, but the awareness is very low. You mentioned that I'm here with two hats on. So as an environmental pension fund, you can't work environmentally without understanding the impacts of climate change. I'm here as well with the IIGCC, so this collective group of investors who are looking at physical risks. I'm doing some work alongside the Australian Super Fund around that. So here's the first thing I would love investors to do. every pension that I know is looking at net zero. I don't know if you can see it on screen. Getting to net zero is the thing. But all those investors also need to think about building resilience, because even if you invest in a wind farm, if it's in the wrong place, it could still be a stranded asset. And that's the problem. So what do we need to know to understand physical risk? Well, the first thing, we need a lot more information coming for the companies that we invest in. They have the information, we want them to disclose it. We want to understand what are their risks. We know that if if companies are going to disclose, it's more likely they disclose in relation to their operations. What about the supply chain? What about the markets? So that's something that's really important. And every single company will be exposed to different risk, and we need to understand that. Now, as a fund, whenever we make our change to our investment portfolio, we then analyze it in relation to a 2-degree world, a 3-degree world, a 4-degree world. How's that going to impact on our investments? Every single fund manager we have, we ask them every time we meet them, how are you managing physical risk on our behalf? And we even turn up at AGMs and we ask the questions of boards direct. What are you doing to manage physical risk? And you can bet your bottom dollar, every time you turn up, we're pretty much the only person asking about physical climate risk. That has to change. Investors have to change too.
That's great, Miriam. Thank you very much. Sounds like you have an awareness of the risk on the physical side, not just the transition risk as an investor, and want that broadly disseminated across the investor landscape, and asking companies about assessing that risk and understanding that risk, which brings us to Catherine. As a strategic at Bechtel, how do you see this risk and awareness of that risk, and what kind of information is available to actually provide investors and other folks in the business and investment community with that kind of information? Catherine?
Thanks, Jay. Well, I look at it a slightly different way. So as Bechtel is a service company, we are an infrastructure delivery company. So when we think of resilience, we're really thinking of it in two ways. One is resiliency projects that we might be able to undertake. And so that's where a locality has identified a risk and wanted to create some sort of physical infrastructure to protect from that. So that might be sea level rise, reinforcement, coastal reinforcements, or it might be flooding, additional flood absorption capacity, or what have you. So kind of a resiliency project. The other piece of it, which is probably much more pervasive and much more common and that we can act on right away, would be integrating resiliency considerations into existing or already planned infrastructure projects. So more and more, but very slowly, owners are starting to ask for climate risk and resiliency evaluations and assessments. That element is incorporated into the sustainability rating systems for infrastructure projects. So programs like Sequel in the UK, Envision in the United States, ISCA in Australia, they all have credits that you get for identifying, assessing, and developing mitigation strategies and commitments for climate risk and resilience. So there are those, it's just asking the question, if you're an investor, and whether you're investing in a project or a company, it's, as Marian said, you have to ask, and get people to start thinking about it. And then depending on the context, for us, a project, it depends on where the project is in the world, what kind of data is available in the methodology. Then you get down to the brass tacks of, well, how do you really figure out what that risk is and what the appropriate responses or the range of responses, because you might not want to protect against the very highest risk from the outset because the cost might be too high. But you can protect against sort of a medium risk within capacity and capability to add to that protection as time goes by and as the risk emerges and maybe more money is available or what have you.
That's great. It sounds like there is absolutely the technical capability at Bechtel and other types of folks out there to analyze this kind of risk under multiple scenarios and provide that information to investors if they ask for it. And that there's a real need to start to integrate that into the way that we think about investments going forward, in addition to looking at the risk in existing investments. And let's turn to Cody, who's a leading entrepreneur with a transformative system changing kind of technology that responds to some of the risk that we're talking about in the climate change universe. So Cody, if you could tell us a bit about your strategy and technology and how climate risk is a driver in that universe.
Yeah, so what we do at Source Global is we bring the principles of renewable energy to water. We do for water what solar did for electricity. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we do that a little bit later, but just to, on the risk front, I sort of think about it in two buckets. One is sort of the static condition and the other one is in the dynamic condition. So the static condition is that today, about 4 billion people around the planet experience severe water scarcity at least 1 month per year. And just about 3 billion people experience that for almost half of the year. And this is not a purely an emerging market problem. This is not purely a sort of desert problem. This happens across every country on every continent on the planet. And that's the static condition. And it's been that way for a long time. Now, the dynamic condition, the mega trends, whether we're talking about sea level rise induced saltwater intrusion into island-based communities, aquifers, overdraw related issues, the fact that there are about 500 billion liters of bottled water sold globally every year. That corresponds to 1% of all anthropogenic carbon is in bottled water. And it's not a luxury for most people. 95% of the market is people using bottled water as a mechanism to get around failing infrastructure. And of course, that results in a huge amount of plastic waste. On the African continent alone, 40 billion hours a year are spent fetching water by mostly women and girls. And that number is going up. So the headwinds are substantial, and that's layered on top of probably the greatest problem facing humanity, right? You think about Maslow's hierarchy, the base of that pyramid, food, water, shelter, the challenges with water are substantial and growing.
That's great to see an understanding of how that challenge is facing everyone, and whether that challenge is being asked about by investors, assessed by strategics, or identified as a really substantial potential megatrend out there by entrepreneurs and technologists. But this is not the race from risk. It is the race to resilience. And so what we're talking about really here is opportunity for investment, opportunity for technology, for services, for long-term asset owners to not just react to or respond to the impact of climate change, but to thrive in a new environment on the other side of it with increased ambition. So Marion, if I can turn it back to you, can you think about or describe for us how investors are thinking about the opportunity for investment in resilience, and and what stops them from having greater ambition or increased opportunity around the investment side of the resilience question? Marion?
Well, yeah, I think, well, for us, I mean, we've set a target, 17% of our assets we want to be invested in solutions that tackle climate change, be it adaptation or mitigation. And for us, that's a driver. We need to go out and find those opportunities. I asked one of our sustainable equity managers what's in our portfolio, and actually he identified 26% of our investments with that particular portfolio was addressing climate change. So things like we were investing in generators, we're expecting more power disruption, we're investing in water infrastructure, better facilities to hold, store, drain floodwaters. I mean, this is just going to be needed. I mean, these opportunities could be vast. Green bonds are coming along from governments. I mean, that is something that's going to be really interesting. We want to invest in green bonds. We want to be investing in the resilience agenda, not just in the transition agenda, as important as both are. I want to also talk, if I may, Jay, about nature-based investment. I hear so much about this. I mean, for me, this is the holy grail. We're already doing this on the mitigation side. We've got, we're investing in sustainable forests, generating carbon credits. What about on the resilience side? What if we could get to a place where we could, for example, manage flood risk? We could do it in a way that protects nature, enhances nature, provides some societal benefits, generates a return for the investor, given our fiduciary duty, we have to generate this return. For me, that is a win-win-win, and that's something that I think would be fantastic.
Well, it's great to hear nature-based solutions in this context considered by real institutional investors. If you think, at Lightsmith, or where my other hat, we're focused on investing around climate resilience and adaptation. And that's kind of an all of the above strategy. We need conventional solutions, new technologies, nature-based solutions to attack this enormous challenge that we'll be facing for multiple generations now, the impact side of climate change. We need all of these kinds of activities to really be pushed forward. Now, Catherine, on the kind of strategic side, with the expertise at Bechtel and other companies like it, where do you see the opportunity set, and what unlocks more of that ambition and potential investment?
I guess building on what Marion had just said about green infrastructure, nature-based infrastructure, that certainly can be incorporated into any kind of project. And one of the things we're starting to look at more and more is what we call green-gray infrastructure, which is sort of a layered approach of what can you do with nature, and then what do you have to supplement, with engineered and other kinds of modern technology infrastructure. So the more we can combine those kinds of things, the better. And I think there's a real opportunity there. There's also an opportunity to try to achieve more than one thing at a time. So when you're thinking about resiliency strategies, and especially something like flood risk or protecting against that, if you can develop an infrastructure that serves multiple purposes. So some examples of this might be parks that have a stream around them, and they serve as overflow areas to absorb the extra stormwater when it comes, and those 1 in 1,000 years or 1 in 100-year events. But yet most of the time, you can use them as a wonderful community amenity. The other opportunity is in terms of design standards and the way you approach things. So again, when you think about resiliency and what you need to kind of protect against, and maybe it's heat, or maybe it's sudden and more extensive rainstorms, then when you're designing a place or a neighborhood or a block or an expanded growth area, you start to put in things that can help with that. So arcades or porticoed colonnades, and as a design standard for that area, so that then you can get shade, you can get shelter, it also looks nice, and everything's kind of uniformity. And we did that on a project in Africa. We were looking at an expansion zone for a city, and we said, well, here's, for the design standards, we'll just include this. So as you're building, you need to follow these rules. So there's opportunities to integrate things like that at little cost. And then there's opportunities to try to, when you're investing in a project, to make it serve multiple purposes. And I think that's where you can do resiliency on the cheap, so to speak.
That's great to hear that there's this upside to it, right? There's benefits by designing these things as we kind of shift to a different integrated approach in a new environment. We're not just trying to protect ourselves from damage, but also generate a different set of opportunities to thrive in a more challenging or more complicated environment going forward. Turning to that opportunity side, Cody, would love to hear about the technology and how opportunities are being created to invest by the need for resilience, and even not just in conventional expansion or incremental change, but the potential for systemic transformative technologies to be brought to bear to bring a totally different architecture to the way we think about it.
Yeah, when I think about, so I've been in the renewable energy space broadly defined for about 20 years, and the challenge, of course, with renewables is that we solve sort of big macro challenges, but not necessarily human factors challenges. And one of the things I'm really excited about with what we do at Source, with Source hydro panels, which are basically look like sort of thicker than normal solar panels, that instead of making electricity with sunlight, we make water with sunlight and air only. So no pipe input, no electrical input. So really taking the principles of renewables, right? That it's distributed, infrastructure free, sustainable, and no input cost, right? Sunlight is free. And applying that to water, meaning that anywhere on the planet, effectively, we can establish an array of source hydro panels and provide drinking water to communities, to schools, to homes, to hospitals, et cetera. We're now doing that, as I said, in 48 countries. And we're solving problems, everything from island communities where overdraws and saltwater intrusion have left them needing to have basically water boated in, to communities where they normally are getting water trucked in, or any number of other issues where you may have internally displaced peoples or refugees where water infrastructure just doesn't exist and there is no additional water resources. So really taking or leveraging the principles of renewables to bring abundance to what is otherwise quite scarce. Just here I'm sitting in Scottsdale, Arizona at the moment, and just up the road is the Navajo Nation, the largest indigenous piece of land in the United States. Out of 150,000 Navajo, 54,000 have no water. And so they're driving long distances to Flagstaff or to Gallup to get drinking water. So the population, the highest per capita COVID rates in the country. And we're now installing source hydro panels at homes across that community, solving that problem in a fundamentally new way.
Well, it's great to hear how technology has really now shifted to meeting some of these new challenges with the potential for dramatic opportunity for investors to begin to deploy capital against this and scale solutions into this new environment driven by increased demand here. Potentially for service providers that analyze and integrate these kinds of technologies and solutions into projects going forward. And necessity and demand driving demand for innovation with entrepreneurs like Cody and Source Global kind of pushing the envelope here in terms of new types of solutions going forward. we have a limited amount of time left and plenty of other things that folks can talk about in the race to resilience. But I wanted just to leave this panel with each of you giving a quick thought on a scale of 1 to 10. What do you think the awareness is currently among the folks that you work with in your investor community or in your strategic corporate community or in the entrepreneurial community about the need for resilience? And then again, on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think the opportunity going forward really is? In this race to resilience, it's important to know where we start and where we can go to. And I'd love your thoughts on a quick 1 to 10 there on both those questions. Miriam?
A very paltry 2, I'm afraid.
On the awareness side, and on the opportunity side?
Opportunity side is endless. I'd go for a 10. I mean, we need this stuff. Yeah, 10.
Fantastic.
10
Catherine?
I was going to say a 3 for awareness, but because some that are aware are taking action and doing it, but there's a lot that don't say anything about it. Although they're aware of it, they just haven't acted upon that awareness, I guess. And then in terms of opportunity, relative to lots of different opportunities, but I definitely say either a 9 or a 10, because there's, when you're anything that we're building, we're going to build for a long time. We don't build disposable things for, around us. And so those things got to last. And we know that they're going to be facing dynamic conditions, as Cody said. And so we've really got to integrate this with everything. So I'd say 9 or 10.
Cody?
Well, I'll end on a hopeful note. I think it's sort of 8 and 8. I've seen a lot of people beginning to buy into the recognition of the challenge, and in doing so, recognizing the opportunity around the fact that the pain is tremendous and the economic dislocations are tremendous, and therefore solutions of any number of ilks should be able to gain from solving these challenges. And so I think there's a huge amount of tailwinds to people coming into the space, capital coming into the space, bringing new thinking to the space, and ultimately providing resilience and adaptive solutions to people who need them most.
Well, I think that's a great collation of numbers. I think we're in the 2 to 3 averaging up with Cody's 8 on the awareness side. I think that's the whole point of making those two numbers start to meet, where the opportunity side at an 8, 9, or 10 is met by the awareness. So the race to resilience, which we hope all of you watching this will join us in, is a race for businesses and communities and innovation and capital, but also for awareness and action going forward. So maybe one last question quickly for each of you. What one thing would you suggest to your own group of stakeholders to unlock more ambition going forward and connecting the dots between that first number to the second number as we think about the path forward and the path towards the race to resilience?
I think to learn from others. I think when investors get together, I think there's a great energy generated. And I think we've seen this net zero, it just sparks ideas, debate, and people follow each other. I think that's the way forward, working together.
I think that is absolutely what we see in the Gary working group as well, is when investors can talk to governments, to other investors, to entrepreneurs, to climate experts, that joint race to resilience, not individual races to resilience,
absolutely,
but really can move everyone forward in a really important way. Catherine?
I think, as I said earlier, it's about asking about it and thinking about it. And when you're going to invest, how can you be sure that your investment is really going to pay off, that it's going to be worth it, that it's going to accomplish the goals that you want it to achieve? And resiliency is a huge part of that, whether it's a company's overall strategy or, project-based considerations like I'm thinking about. But the other important thing to mention is it shouldn't just be looked at project by project, but we also need to be thinking of resiliency of systems. So is your project set up within the system to be resilient? And if, how does it interact, and it either fosters, something else, or it depends on other things? And so how do we also improve the resiliency of the system? And I think that's where there's tremendous opportunity to close that gap.
I think that's an excellent point. Naoko Ishii has said, as a former head of the GEF, that we should take not an incremental approach to resilience and adaptation, not just build the seawall 1 foot higher or move 1 foot back further from the shoreline, but a systemic transformational approach where we recognize that there's interrelatedness. My resiliency is dependent on your resiliency and vice versa. And that long-term systems transformation, including nature solutions, including conventional solutions, including new technologies, is kind of a critical component of that as well. But what else do you think would unlock this kind of ambition, this kind of activity. Cody?
I'll build off of Catherine's comments. I kind of think about it as two pieces, sort of this concept of deep partnering and the concept of going slow to go fast. You know, we work with a lot of indigenous groups, and I've sort of taken on this, don't take the numbers too literally, but that the technology is really 2% of the solution and 98% is the people, and really figuring out what their true needs are. And you could extend that, of course, to investors, other stakeholders, supply chains, end users. You know, you can imagine all of the stakeholders in that ecosystem as needing to have a seat at the table from the beginning to the final, you know, sort of end solution. And in the absence of doing that, we end up just sort of you know, poking holes in the paper and seeing a little bit of light led through, as opposed to going ahead and drawing the curtains back.
I think that's absolutely true. So it's a need to really approach this in a joint manner, in a deep and partnering manner, right? So the race to resilience doesn't end, and it's not individual. It involves really kind of thinking about this deeply. I think one of the key focal points in the targeting of the race to resilience is a focus on benefiting people, right? With a target of reaching, safeguarding, increasing the resilience of up to 4 billion people by the target date set by the climate champions. And I think all of the things you're talking about, whether it's investors supplying that capital and making those inquiries, thinking about resilience, folks thinking about that in an integrated systems-oriented way, and then providing this concrete solutions and technologies to solve that problem are really critical to making it to that point. So I'll let you each have one last word in a call to action in the race to resilience. Would love just to hear one last thought, that if you could reach the folks out there that are watching this panel today, what would you leave us with today? Miriam?
I'd say that the resilience agenda is just as important as the net zero agenda. And I think it's great, this initiative, Race to Resilience, to raise the profile amongst all of the community members.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I just think the consciousness has to be there, the request needs to be there, and well, not even a request, we should demand it. We need to demand that all investments, whether, you know, whatever they're in for anything in the future, really incorporate a resiliency assessment and a commitment to resiliency as part of the protocol going forward.
The thing I love about the term resiliency is it's implicitly a human factors thing, right? We are making people more resilient to the environment that they find themselves in, or things that might happen ahead of them. And so, you know, thinking about how we best position people, with technology for social equity, investing for social equity, partnering for social equity, and ultimately to elevate the human condition. That's the best possible way you could spend your life's energy. So I hope lots more like-minded people come to the table to help advance the ball here.
That's great. So you've heard it's an equal priority and a critical priority. We should demand action on these things, especially understanding the risk and understanding the opportunity, and then really paying attention to integrating it in a way that we think about mobilizing people and focusing on people is really part of the end state here. So that's it from our panel on business and investment in the race to resilience. I would say climate risk is a today risk, and it's a humanitarian risk, and it's a financial risk. But climate resilience is also a today opportunity and an investment opportunity. And I think that's what you've heard on this panel. Private sector is here, from investors to strategics to technologists and entrepreneurs. And really thank you for spending the time with us today on our focus on business, investment, and the race to resilience. Thank you very much.
Patrick Verkooyen, I'm the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. Because while we have seen today the case for ambitious adaptation is clear, it's clearly not happening at nearly the pace and scale required. The pandemic has ushered in an era of multiple intersecting systemic shocks, and one of its casualties is climate adaptation. At the GCA, our latest report, State and Trends in Adaptation, it shows that investment in climate adaptation fell last year, even as more than 50 million people were affected by a record number of floods, droughts, wildfires, and storms. The pandemic is eroding recent progress in building climate resilience, leaving countries and communities even more vulnerable to future shocks. Building resilience to climate impacts must be a vital component of our response and recovery efforts as we look to build forward better from COVID-19. Race for Resilience is an incredibly important initiative, and I would like to personally thank Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz, our high-level champions, for making it happen. We're all in this race together, and we simply don't have a moment to lose. The stakes could not be higher. Successful adaptation and resilience will be instrumental in creating a more sustainable, healthier, and fairer world in which we all live within the resources of our planet. Here at GCA, we strongly endorse your ambition target to build the resilience of 4 billion people, and I look forward to working closely with you to ensure we accelerate adaptation action to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Hello. First, I would like to thank Patrick for his excellent remarks and endorsement of the Race to Resilience campaign. Patrick, we're so delighted to be working with the Global Center on Adaptation, and definitely Nadia and I wanted to thank you for all your hard work in making the entire Climate Adaptation Summit such a success. Really, really well done, my friend. So we have had 3 excellent panel discussions covering elements which will be definitely key for the success of Race to Resilience. First one, working both with urban and rural communities. Second, of course, working with nature. And the third one, we need to be working with the business. I also would like to thank all the panelists and moderators for the insights and to the statements from initiatives who have already expressed their interest to join. As Nigel said, the Race to Resilience is now on, and we are so proud of it. It makes sense, and it's so much needed. Therefore, I wanted to reflect on why Nigel and I are so committed to this race and why our ambition is so high on making the difference to lives of billions, not millions of people. We simply do not think it is morally right to let the predictions of the impacts of climate change come true. It is unacceptable to let the prediction of 100 million people pushed into extreme poverty by 2030. It is unacceptable to let the number of people who lack sufficient water to increase by 5 billion by 2050. It's absolutely unacceptable for millions of people in coastal cities to be driven from their homes. Many, many more things which are not only unacceptable, but unmoral. So to stop this prediction, and yes, as these are all predictions, we can definitely stop them from coming true. We need both the race to zero to succeed and the race to resilience to succeed. Action is so much urgent and must happen now. So please join our team and become a member to Race to Resilience and Race to Zero. Details on how to join will be shared at the end of this event. We know we are absolutely at a unique point. The pandemic has demonstrated the importance of resilience and the need of transforming our society and economies to be more sustainable and resilient. We must not miss the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to embed climate action in COVID recovery programs to achieve the transformative social and economic changes that are needed for a safe and prosperous resilient future. I would like to end by thanking, of course, the government of the Netherlands for hosting the Climate Adaptation Summit and the Adrian Hash Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, to the Global Resilience Partnership and the Global Center for Adaptation for organizing this crucial event in this absolutely critical year. Thank you very much.